Welcome back to Sci-Fi Book Trick. Today we'll be doing a review of Isaac Asimov's I, Robot short story collection. This, of course, is a collection of 9 short stories written by Isaac Asimov between 1940 and 1950. Thereabouts, published in different magazines, but this has a framing device around it with Susan Calvin, one of the main characters, being interviewed by a reporter at the end of her career. Now, though this is called I, Robot, it's not to be confused with the earlier 1939 story by Orlando Binder, which is an underplume of Earl and Otis Binder. And on a side note, Otis Binder was the co-creator of Supergirl. But anyway, that story actually inspired Asimov to write his first robot story, Robbie. And when the collection was published and was called I, Robot, Asimov disagreed with the publisher that it should be called that. He felt overshadow or tried to claim ownership of that original story he liked.
So the first story in the collection, titled Robbie, is Asimov's 14th story and his 9th published work. It's considered the first in the Robot series. Which brings us on to our author section itself. So, Isaac Asimov was born on an unknown date between October the 4th in 1919 and January the 2nd, 1920 in Petrovichi, a village in Russia's Smolensk Oblast region. Asimov chose to celebrate his birthday on January the 2nd after finding out the issue in his birth date was caused by his mother trying to get him into school earlier. At the age of 1 year old, he contracted a case of pneumonia along with 16 other children in his village, and he was the only survivor of that outbreak. He left Russia at 3 years old with his parents and sister, emigrating to the United States, and became a naturalized civilian at the age of 8 years old.
Nuclear vessels.
Grew up in Brooklyn, New York, where he attended public school, and later would study chemistry at degree level, after switching from zoology after his first semester. He'd then go on to earn his doctorate in chemistry in 1948. Asimov's love of science fiction began in 1929 when he was reading pulp science fiction novels in his family's store. At first, his father forbid him from reading it until he argued that because it had science in the name, it was educational.
It's educational.
What if she cuts herself?
That will be an important lesson.
And it was a candy store. Selling sweets and magazines.
I feel like a kid in some kind of a store.
Thinking to write professionally, he began writing his science fiction story in 1937 called Cosmic Corkscrew. He finished the story and submitted it personally to the editor at the time, John W. Campbell, who was editor of Astounding Science Fiction at the time. Campbell would ultimately reject the story, but the two formed a strong friendship, and Campbell would encourage him to keep writing and provide important feedback during his formative years as a writer. Asimov was a prolific writer and not only wrote in science fiction, but also dabbled in mystery and fantasy novels, as well as tons and tons of non-fiction work, and an estimated 90,000 letters and postcards. But the contents of the I, Robot short story collection have publishing dates from 1940 all the way through to 1950. So as a result, we've decided to stick to the 1950 publication date, which, as you've said, includes the framing device. So with that in mind, we'll go on to our publication year of 1950.
For the first one, I went English. The Eagle comic launches.
I did notice that one, yeah.
And it had to start off with a number of stories, but the ones people might have heard of would be Dan Dare and, of course, Captain Pugwash, who only lasted, I think, 12 comics, and then was took out because it was considered too childish.
Where's the rest of the ship? Sunk without trace, Masturbate. Masturbate.
Masturbate.
Can't imagine why.
So my first one is James Dean receives his big break after starring in a Pepsi commercial.
I swear I'd learned something, but I have stickers on my piano.
What do you mean by stickers?
Oh, like, not stickers, like pieces of tape.
Pepsi-Cola hits the spot, a big bottle and it's got...
James Dean, of course, being the American screen star.
Yes, who we probably wouldn't have heard of if he hadn't have died in the car crash.
Well, yes, he only had a short-lived career, which came to a rather abrupt end.
Тут это было. Стою я вчера, в общем. Сигарету курю, никому не мешаю, и вдруг откуда ни возьмись, такая бешеная машина. Ну, примерно вот так вот, но та желтая была.
People born this year, one of the biggest names would be Bill Murray.
Do you reject Satan and all his evils?
Sure. And for you...
Don't say John Bon Jovi.
Richard Dean Anderson.
Ah, cool.
And for you...
Wait a minute!
So, did you know that the first VW Type 2, which is also known as the microbus, rolled off the assembly line this year?
Oh, no.
Terrible looking thing. Ah.
Well, for a cultural note, films that came out this year: Treasure Island. Now everyone knows how a pirate speaks from that film.
Tap him in irons. If I'm to take any more of his source.
Oh, and a bottle of rum.
Because pirates didn't really speak like that. With a great film, Harvey, about a giant white rabbit.
Drop it, don't slip. No, you're sure this is all right? You wouldn't rather sit in a booth? Well, all right.
Which would then have its sequel, Donnie Darko, later.
Donnie Darko's not as fun as Harvey. Trust me, I would rather watch Harvey. And also, a small production, The Elusive Pimpernel, starring David Niven.
Yeah, right.
It's a good film.
Yeah, I mean...
They seek him here, they seek him there.
An old hag in a cart full of melons.
Yes, Captain. She's all right. I let her through.
Mine are Annie Get Your Gun, Cinderella, and Sunset Boulevard.
Go with my lists. My list of better films.
Okay.
Right, and we shall move on to the inside of the book.
So, each story has a range of characters with a few reoccurring. Most notably is the character of Dr. Susan Calvin, who is a robot psychologist. And
I mean, she does appear in like a lot of the robot stories.
As well as being one of the characters that is responsible for the framing device that binds them all together. There's a couple of others that we have Powell and Donovan, who feature much more as side characters, I would say, but they still feature as sort of...
They're sort of, I don't want to say guinea pigs, but the testers of like new robots and stuff like that.
I gotta be honest, I started seeing them as a bit of a Laurel and Hardy duo.
Yes.
And I don't know whether that was intended.
Well,
Here's another nice mess you've gotten me into.
Well, I couldn't help it. You told me I was using your place.
They do end up in some humorous stories, but
Yeah,
then
and they do tend to argue with each other a lot.
the only other notable character I can remember from the stories is a major player in the last two, which is Stephen Biley. The setting of the stories, it's based all over a time period between burgeoning robotics as robotics is starting to become a thing, right up until the point where essentially humanity has disappeared out into the cosmos. All of it is pretty much set over the events of Susan's life, and it could also almost be called sort of a biography. I mean, the framing device is basically an interview.
The outlier story would probably be the first one, Robbie.
Yeah.
Because it seems disconnected from the rest. Although Susan does make a sort of appearance, but I'm not sure whether that's originally she was in it or not. The next one, which is was Run Around.
You run around, I run around. We're all gonna run around.
That is the first story to actually put down the 3 laws of robotics.
Yes, which feature as a major theme point for pretty much the entire narrative.
And, has gone on beyond Asimov's work into other people's works and stuff like that. And also, you could say, inspired many other portrayals of androids and robots.
Mm-hmm.
Even sort of like his description of like the positronic brain is essentially
data from Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was the stun setting. This is not.
So because it's a set of short stories, each story tends to have its own theme.
With the robot laws or...
Yeah, acting as a framework.
Yeah. You understand the logic, you can see where it's going, but even when it goes, where you predicted it, it's still a comforting thought. It's what I expected, but also it's still a nice thing. At least for me.
Well, isn't that nice?
I mean, one thing I will say about this is it being a collection of short stories, even despite the fact that this was written from 1940 to 1950, the stories do follow a logical progression, and even the end story, the evitable conflict, it's a conclusion point. It's essentially drawing all those stories into a nice big bow. Whereas if it was read on its own with no context, I don't think you would get that same meaning from it.
I'm surprised how much humanity is captured within it, and how much human emotion expressions come through.
I think it helps the fact that we're following Susan Calvin, and the psychologist element of that is brought.
But even Susan Calvin, she seems the closest to a robot than any other characters, apart from like one story.
She has
the robot herself.
She does say that she has a preference for robots above humans. So,
and like I kind of understand that. I kind of like, I like her as a character.
I think she comes across really, really well. It's not her story, but she does feature prominently, and it's interesting to see how she develops from the story where we're first introduced to her, which I believe is Liar.
Liar!
She does come across as a sort of voice of reason and logic, apart from one point where don't get on the bad side.
Oh yeah.
Jesus.
Oh my.
She comes across the best, because most of the men who are recurring, most of the time are spent arguing amongst themselves and threatening violence to one another.
Well, yes.
We welcome you to the Royal Rumble!
Which I did find interesting. I don't know whether that was something he was going for. Probably not, but yeah, I mean, overall, he's good to read. I mean,
shall we move
there
on to
are ups and downs,
recommendations?
but yeah, we'll go on to recommendations. What do you think?
I absolutely enjoyed every single moment of it.
I mean, were there any low points or many low points?
I mean, I'd have to.
I mean, would you
bring
say
that
they all hit, or some were just like
Some-
damp squids or misses?
Some hit less than others. As I mentioned before, the inevitable conflict feels more like a coda to the entire group rather than as a standalone story. There's one, like, escape for me felt like a fun bit of fluff.
Yes.
But not unlikable.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, the rest of them, they do have things to say, and I think they do come across really, really well. Certainly as a collection. I could easily read them as short stories as well. But yeah, highly recommended. I thought that this was really, really good.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I really like it as well. I like Asimov's work. I like how logical it is. And though some of the stories were, I would say, average for me occasionally, there was nothing that dipped below, like, into bad or meh. It was just like, oh, it's okay. And then there were some stories which were just phenomenal. So, for me, it's highly recommended.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, you can certainly pick up copies of this in all sorts of forms and formats. Admittedly, the one with Will Smith on the cover, I mean, it nothing to do. The film is nothing to do with the book, even very, very loosely.
Yeah, well, we can go over that in spoilers. But yeah, the film, it takes some ideas, but it's essentially a different script from a different creator.
Yeah. But you'll probably find this, you can find it in the collections. There are other collections, including The Complete Robot, which also features them, as well as other Asimov's work. You'll find them in other science fiction collected works, such as Great Science Fiction Stories, which is where you were reading this from.
Yeah, but this is a rather big book. It's got different authors in it. So. But yeah, I would say if you're tentative or just want to experience it, picking up a copy of The iRobot is probably the best way, because the other Complete Robots, they are bigger book, so it might be a bit more daunting. So go in, read this. If you like it, go on for the Complete Robot. So.
And then there's also, of course, the Foundation series, which did become part of the series later.
Yeah.
But yeah, pick it up from pretty much anywhere.
Right, I guess that's about it for today. So if you want to join us for spoilers, tune in next week. If not, come back in a fortnight's time and we'll be reviewing a completely different book.
Bye.
Alright, so I guess that's it.
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
Shut up, robot!
We can't even have logical robots today.